this week has been busy. Our to-do list included coordinating a prayer vigil for Charlottesville, a memorial service and wake, a sermon for my list, and a Bridges run. And our continued efforts in my household to build a baby. And to top it off, I convinced myself that obsessively reading and analyzing reactions to the white supremacy marches in Charlottesville counted as online sermon preparation. So indeed, some of that was helpful and inspiring, and some of it was perhaps a way to numb some of my fear and grief this week. So perhaps for another sermon on another day, we could explore the practice of distinguishing between numbing online and finding meaningful, mindful reading. So at times this week, I have been stuck between too many words and other times not a single one. How can we possibly capture the original sins of our country and our neglectful attempts at repairing those original wounds? And how can we balance the harsh reality with hope and beauty of God's mercy and justice, the beauty of God's creation? How can we call out and name evil for what it is, while also naming limitations in ourselves and our communities and all the ways that we can grow together? And how can we be moved towards action, filled with hope and courage and God's love? That was all on my to-do list this week. No big deal. And let me share up front that some of that work will have to happen in ongoing conversations and in ongoing intentional time that we spend together as a church community moving forward. So last weekend, Brantley and I were at our family baby shower at my brother's house in Northern Virginia. And then a few hours later, I was making bracelets with my 7-year-old nieces, who in the end wrapped them up in these tight little balls of yellow tissue paper as a gift for our baby girl. And in the middle of making bracelets, I heard about Heather Heyer's death. So there it is, life and death, love and hate all balled up together. And when you're building a baby and our country's brokenness and original sin is so apparent, so emboldened, it's a bit scary. As a new parent, it already feels vulnerable to birth something so fragile into the world. But this year, those feelings seem magnified as we face together the complex systemic injustice. So many of them, like climate change and institutional racism, poverty, globalism, all while holding in prayer and in protest an administration in power that is in denial at best and actively immoral at its worst. And let me pause here to say that a lot of white folks, including myself, have been baffled or surprised by the level of overt misogyny and racism and white supremacy of folks, and even folks who hold power and office in our country. And it takes discipline and reminders from a lot of my friends of color to help me reorient and remember that this is really not new. The Dr. Reverend Barber writes, in order to understand American history, you have to understand that what we see now is as American as apple pie. When someone uses racial fear and hatred to excite people's temperament, this same process happened right after the Civil War. There's a period called Reconstruction, followed by a period of deconstruction, when people used racial fear and attacked on our voting rights. And this same thing happened after the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Barber asserts that we are in the birth pains of a third Reconstruction. And during this time, we need a revolution of values. We need a moral revival that deals with systemic racism and policies that hurt our people. So speaking of reviving our morals, one day a Canaanite mother tracked down Jesus. She is on her home turf, and Jesus is out of his comfort zone in the land of Gentiles. And perhaps Jesus is also worn out and tired. This mother is desperate, and Jesus is, quite frankly, excuse my language, a bit of an ass. She comes to Jesus, a Canaanite, a known enemy of the people of Israel, an idol worshiper according to the social norms of Jesus' community. And this mom asks Jesus, the healer, the Son of God, to heal her daughter. Jesus ignores her, and then she shouts. He almost dismisses her, and she kneels, beckoning for him to have mercy to heal her daughter. Then he denigrates her, calling her a common derogatory name for a Canaanite woman at the time. He calls her a little dog. She comes back with a savvy retort. Even little dogs get crumbs underneath the master's table. And for whatever reason, this gets through to Jesus. He heals her daughter, and he revels in the great faith of this persistent mother. So Jesus is worn out. He gets it wrong. He says something prejudiced, even racist, and he takes a good amount of time to overcome his lack of compassion. But this text is important and unique for two reasons. First, Jesus rarely rebukes or turns someone away who's marginalized. He does, however, come out pretty strong against those who are in power, religious leaders, or those who think they have it all together. So this story is rare and interesting. Another important reading of this text is that it perhaps represents a turning point in Jesus' ministry, when he encounters someone who he has been taught that that person is less than his people, less than himself. And eventually, he manages to find empathy for her. Perhaps this is Jesus' own moral, even spiritual revival. I like to imagine that this incident introduced Jesus to the foundational teachings and ideas for his own ministry. Blessed are the poor. The humble will be exalted. Love your neighbor as yourself, even when that neighbor is a Samaritan or a Canaanite woman. So what do we do when we are tired, vulnerable, and when we fail, even like Jesus? What do we do when we are grief-stricken and angry at injustice in our nation and in our world? Like this great woman of faith, this mother, we shout, we kneel, we beckon, we are savvy, and we persist. But here's an important response to the challenges of our season. We, as a people of faith, need to say out loud, white supremacy is a sin. And it is not just a sin, it is our country's sin. In fact, historically speaking, white supremacy is a sin of the mainline Protestant church, our church tradition among many others. We all know Dr. King talked about how the most segregated hour was on Sunday morning, right here and right now. Passive and active participation in systemic racism is our sin, dare I say, the sin of white folks, all of us, not just extremists. It's really important to understand the two levels of racism. There's personal prejudice, which we all subconsciously carry, and there are institutional powers in our country, in our town, that are unjust, in which we all accidentally participate and perpetuate. And we have a new round of race dialogue circles through our Interfaith Council this fall for anybody who wants to learn more about dialogue on race. It's a beautiful and safe and non-judgmental space, and I'd be happy to answer questions for you. The last piece of this naming of our sins piece is that we need to remember that white supremacy is a sin even here in northern New Jersey. It can be easy to kind of have snap judgments or stereotypes about the North and the South. And in doing so, we kind of offload some of the blame for the injustices that exist in our country onto other regions. But what if systemic racism, yes, looks different in each community, but it is equally present? Here's the deal about Charlottesville that I learned in one of my news binges this week. On their town council, before they voted to take down the statue, which became the lightning rod for the gathering, the council voted to unanimously set up an equity fund, which would support an African American Heritage Center, funding for a local African American community park, GED training for folks in public housing, and the list goes on. Now, this does not suggest to me that Charlottesville or UVA is a place where they have healed their local iterations of systemic racism. However, it does suggest to me that they have courageous leaders and constituents who are willing to look honestly at their history, their local history of oppression, and make amends to begin overt processes of reconciliation. Now, this is why Charlottesville is such an easy target for this white supremacist movement, because their local government is taking a stand for justice, love and hate side by side. So I wonder what it would look like for us to take a hard and honest look at some of the iterations of systemic racism in our town, historically and currently, and in our region, and what it would look like to take specific actions of reconciliation and healing in those areas. And during that process, what do we do when we, like Jesus, are confronted with our own personal vulnerability, our own limitation and fear, our prejudice and white privilege? Where do we even begin? Reformed white nationalist Christian Picciolini did a recent interview on NPR, and he spoke about his work and his organization with recovering white nationalists who need mentoring, community, and a sense of identity after leaving their extremist groups. Picciolini shares that when folks have meaningful interaction with someone they claim to hate, when they receive compassion from people that they deserve it from the least, that is the most transformative process he's seen. And this man, he's seen it happen hundreds and hundreds of times. So what can we do as a church, as a beloved community, to get proximate to folks who are different from us, to give and receive compassion from communities that we are separated from in so many ways? And like the mother who comes to Jesus, when we draw close, may we have the courage to cry out together, "Have mercy, O God, heal us for the sake of our children and our children's children." May we work together in this community to build beloved communities for and with the next generation. The white supremacists in Charlottesville embodied radicalized fear and vulnerability, and those fears birthed hatred and tribalism and violence. And instead of shouting, "Have mercy," out of their hatred came the cry, "You will not replace us." Author and activist Brian McLaren writes, "All of us, especially people of faith, need to proclaim that white supremacy and white privilege, all other forms of racism and injustice, must indeed be replaced with something better. They must be replaced with beloved communities who are welcome and safe, where all are free. White supremacist dreams must be replaced with a better dream, where people of all tribes and races and creeds and nations learn to live in peace and mutual respect." So, beloved community, Christ Church, we are of many tribes and creeds and races. Out of our fear and our grief, let us birth kindness and courage. Let us birth strength and community and resolve for the work ahead. And now, holding on to peace and love, let us go out in hope. Amen.